So welcome everyone to another session of the Gerhardt Center webinar series from the School of Business at the American University in Cairo in Egypt. And I'm really pleased today to have Professor Arnold Smit join us. He's from the University of Stellenbosch Business School, and also a good friend that I met some years ago when we met to discuss parts of what we're going to be discussing today, which is giving voice to values. So I'm really pleased that you're here. Welcome, and thank you for giving us your time. And I think just to kind of start, and welcome everyone as well from different areas, different places. Thank you for joining. So I think just if we can start, Arnold, if you can just sort of tell us, I mean, there's been a lot in the news, particularly in the last couple of years, about sort of values and ethics and leadership and all these sorts of conversations. And obviously perhaps with COVID or without COVID, these have perhaps been exacerbated a little bit. So maybe we can kind of just start with the why question. So why is it now that we're talking a lot more about values and ethics, and we kind of have this, renewed sense of what the world or how the world should act? So maybe if we can start with the question of why, please.
Yeah. From my side, before I start, good evening, Nelly, and everyone on the webinar. It's great to be here, and once again, thank you for the lovely invitation to participate in your conversation. Well, I think it's an important question that you ask. We as a humanity might feel a bit exposed, I think, at the moment, because we deal with multiple challenges. You've already referred to COVID. And apart from the terrible nature of the pandemic itself, I think it has put us in front of questions such as how much do we care? Do we really take other people into account in our decisions and in our behaviors? At the same time, in my country and in many other countries across the world, we also saw huge corruption scandals that erupted across the world, which is about making money on the back of intense human suffering. I mean, how scandalous can that be? But we also confronted together with this, with an intensifying climate crisis. And once again, it's about what is the price that we're willing to pay, the sacrifices that we're willing to make. Are we simply short-term orientated in terms of what is beneficial to us without any cognizance of what is due to the next generation? Or, for instance, in terms of the people that we now share the planet with. So can we continue living as we have done for so long, irrespective of the long-term impact and consequences? And then to top it all, in the midst of the pandemic last year, we, from the USA spreading across the world, we were confronted with the Black Lives Matter movement. And there it is all about interracial relationships and dealing with issues, for instance, around diversity and equity and inclusion. I think we are surrounded with and engaged with quite a number of issues. I have just mentioned these three, and all of them, in order for us to figure out what to do, how to live, how to lead, all of them involve ethics and values. And the way in which we as human beings, individually and collectively, are going to approach these challenges.
I think just maybe related to that, I mean, obviously you've been working, teaching, researching in this field for many, many years. How has sort of the definition, if you like, I don't like using the word definition because it's so difficult to define what virtue or what ethics sometimes is, or values, but how has the sort of the definition or the discourse changed? So I think we talked about, a few key events. Maybe that helps us understand the why. But if we maybe think about, and I suppose for the benefit of a lot of our students here, that we use the theory, we use the definitions. How has the kind of the definition, maybe even in academic research, changed over the years?
My own experience is that when we talk to people about ethics and ethical schools of thought and frameworks, that people feel a bit lost and kind of feel that that's the world of the philosophers. If you talk about deontology and utilitarianism and virtue ethics and so forth, people seem to shut down and regard this as a world distant from themselves. Understanding the choices, yes, that that these frameworks demand from people or presuppose from people. I find the shift specifically being brought about by someone like Mary Gentile's work on giving voice to values and the shift towards values. I find that kind of a kinder way in which people engage much easier with. If we talk about, for instance, values as aspirational beliefs, the best that we expect from ourselves and others, that guide our actions, our behaviors, and our decisions in terms of what is best for the greater good. And we start talking about ordinary, everyday values that we all have a stake in, if you wish, because of the fact that we are human beings, such as honesty, respect, responsibility, fairness, compassion. These values people seem to understand quite well. They seem to be engaging with them quite well. You don't need a lot of explanation to do in the process. And my experience in working with groups, specifically in focusing on values, using that as a starting point for the conversation, is that they understand the benefits that we accrue from upholding these values in terms of the development of trust, collaboration among people, the energy that you harvest within teams, the peace and collaboration that you might have within families as a result. And then on the flip side, the loss of trust, the disillusionment, the disengagement that follows when people are confronted, for instance, with dishonesty, with disrespect, with a lack of responsibility, with an experience of unfairness and lack of compassion. It is as a result of this that we are enabled to enter into the ethics conversation in terms of ultimately deciding what is the best to do with the circumstances that we have on hand. So it's not necessarily, I think, a matter of how we developed, but I do think that the values conversation is more accessible. People understand it, they engage with it because it's the ordinary stuff which relationships are being made of.
I think a lot of the sort of the points that you mentioned, I suppose, if you like, are idealistic, and I think that obviously, you're obviously in South Africa, we're in Egypt, I'm half English, we have people from all over the world. And so automatically people's, it would be ideal if we all had the same definition of respect and trust and ethics and all of these sorts of things. But of course, they're, if you like, sometimes overcast by culture, organizational, national, by religion, by gender, by all of these factors. And is it now that we have some sort of scarcity, or we just don't have ethical leaders, or we don't have ethical people anymore? And is this something that has changed over the years? Do we have some sort of, can we have societies where there is a scarcity of ethical people and leaders? Sort of in work, in government, if you like, we've seen so many things. Like you said, Black Lives Matters. We've seen, lots of major events in the Middle East, in the UK, in Europe, all over the world. So is it that we have some sort of scarcity of ethical leaders or ethical people? And what do you think, like, the future will bring? Are we going into some sort of, into some sort of dark hole, because there's so many discussions about this, and one is becoming disillusioned, so maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I think there are two questions involved in what you have just raised. The one question I think taps into, so where do we learn our values and the meaning thereof? For me, it is important to make a distinction between what I value and the values that I have in common with others. I might value many things in life. I might value comfort. I might value a good income. I might value a stable job. I might value a safe house and neighborhood and community to live in. But the values that we are talking about here, and I prefer also to work with these kind of 5 core values. I've already mentioned them: honesty, respect, responsibility, fairness, and compassion. It is indeed, as you have said, that they might mean different things for different people in different contexts. But my experience is that when you put people working in the same organization or people with a collective interest in a project or so, if you put them in the same room, it is not difficult for them to come to an understanding of what it means for them within their context, which I think teaches us an important thing. It teaches us that we are confronted with a challenge of, on the one hand, recognizing that we might, due to birth and heritage and so, come from different places. But when we come together to work together in organizations, be those organizations a university, be it a company, be it a government department, we have to engage in what I like to refer to as norm-producing conversations. In other words, leaders need to and individuals in general, but leaders in particular, need to develop the capability of engaging other people in conversations in which help them to agree on what these values mean and how to apply them in the working context, whichever that context might be. So that, I think, is an important challenge to undertake. The other side of the question that you have asked is about whether we have a scarcity, for instance, of good leaders, or why it is the case that we seem to be in the position where we are. I don't think we necessarily have a scarcity of ethical people. My experience, broadly speaking, is that people understand what it is about, but there are complexities involved. In a variety of settings, in organizations, in societies, and so. And sometimes people find the complexities in terms of what a situation as big, for instance, as a climate change challenge might be on the one hand, or corruption, for instance, in supply chains on the other hand, or dilemmas around, for instance, appointments where you might have political pressure on appointment and procurement processes, that people find these challenges overwhelming. And then they might either choose not to become involved and say, that's too big for me, I'm not going to engage with this. That on the one hand. And on the other hand, they might say, you know what, as long as I take care of myself, I'm not going to be bothered by what's happening to the rest. In other words, making selfish choices. And that, I think, represents for us this kind of idea that we sit with a dearth of ethical leadership. I don't think it's as a lack of the knowledge about what ethics and values are about. I think it's about context and complexity. But I think there's another aspect as well. There are quite often people dynamics involved. You have raised the possibility that culture might play a role in suppressing, for instance, certain values-driven practices. Not all societies, for instance, work in the same manner with relationships. More often than I think than what we might realize, there are power dynamics that play a role. It's one thing, for instance, for me as an individual, if I can just make an example, to call somebody to account that's reporting to me if I'm the one in power. It is altogether a different challenge if you and I need to deal as people on equal footing and you being a friend of mine, when we need to deal with something that might be ethically compromising, such as, for instance, around appointments, procurement, whatever the situation might be, and you, my friend, and am I going to stand up and live and express what I believe, or call you to account? What's it going to do to our relationship? Will we still have a relationship afterwards? What happens to collegiality, for instance, if that was the case, that we would work, for instance, in the same organization? It's then another challenge if it's my boss. And it might be that I have a particular view on something unethical or untoward that my boss is involved with. And now I need to express myself in the presence of power, and people might experience that as a career limiting action, for instance. So there are quite a number of things that are involved, I think, in this question. And eventually it might be the question of how do we find a way towards dealing with that? Because we can do nothing about the fact that this complexity is there. But how do we deal with that? I think that's the question. Can we deal with it? That is perhaps a question to further pursue.
Yeah, when you were talking sort of about the organizational culture part and people having the same values and working together, it reminded me of a couple of things. One is sort of, this idea that culture is this systematic brainwashing of people, organizational culture. And also Mary Jo Hatch's work that, talks about kind of identity and organizational identity and mirroring a person's identity into the organization and then back out into customer society. And obviously then sometimes we see when people's values don't align with that of the organizations, we see detachment and a decrease in sense of belonging. So, I'm just imagining, say, an organization where it just kind of ticks along and goes along, and we don't see a leader. We don't have, if you like, events or meetings that actually build a culture. And I think a lot of when we talk about values and ethics, it's so bound with an organizational culture. And so how does a leader create? What do you do? Do you say, everyone come to a board meeting, these are our values, and we all have them, including where I'm guessing you work and where I work as well, these, values of your school, of your university, of your corporate, whatever, and I always raise eyebrows, at where is this sort of these fluffy things, so maybe you can talk a little bit about, how is it that we create this, what do we do? Do we ask people, in a job interview, and I've been asked it, and I'm sure many of us, if you saw something wrong, what would you do? And we all would say, of course, we would report it and we would follow, protocol. And of course, if that happened, it would be totally different. And I say this to my, students, and we use the Heinz dilemma as well. So, what do you do as a leader? Do you have a microphone and every day say to people, right, these are our values, let's huddle together? And how is this built within an organization?
Yeah, it's an important and I think a tough question that you're asking here. It's one thing to have values and to rave about them. It's quite a different thing to apply and practice that in relationships, in operations, and so forth. And you're quite right. Leaders need to set the tone by means of the way in which they are themselves examples of ethicality. But setting the tone can also be in a manner that makes people afraid of engaging, of communicating, of reporting that which speaks against values or are downright unethical. So in the training that we do with people, we, for instance, develop what we call the skill of active listening, the skill of being present to others when they do have concerns that they need to discuss. There need to be a culture of openness, but also a willingness to allow people to express whatever discomforts they might have. And that does not come naturally. But the one thing that leaders sometimes forget, I think, is that not having time to engage in these conversations or to be available for people who experience this kind of discomfort does not make an ethical problem go away. It just pops out elsewhere. And that elsewhere might be in the press, in the public, where the reputational damage to the organization might become quite severe. So the manner in which we lead ethically also need to create space, to create comfort, to create openness for people to engage with the discomforts that they carry within themselves. On the other hand, there's another aspect. One needs to get concerned where a conversation about values points in the direction of such a tight alignment around a specific set of beliefs and a particular way of doing that constructive deviation is not possible. In other words, that people as a result of that actually become afraid to speak up. So there is a shadow side to this kind of blind loyalty to organizational culture. A culture that does not allow for deviance, that does not allow for constructive conversation and criticism, is a culture that one needs to be really concerned about. And then I think there is a third factor that I also would like to raise, and that is that leaders, I think there's a fourfold task for leaders. They need to care about the relationship between the organization and society. They need to care for the ethical culture and character and identity of an organization. But they also need to learn how to make conversations about values and ethics possible. And I think the struggle of leaders is that they might sometimes be so driven with operational effectiveness and strategic commitment that they fail to make the time to pull up the brake and say, now it is the time to second guess what we are doing and to make room for a values-driven conversation. So you have referred, for instance, to being asked in an interview about what are your values and what will you do in a particular set of circumstances. I think that's very late in the process to ask those questions when the person sits across the table from you. That conversation needs to start when you open up the recruitment process. How in this process might our values become important for us? How are the values built into the way in which we are seeking for recruits? How do we apply them in the way in which we engage with recruits? How do we also afterwards, in terms of the pipeline of activities, make sure that we introduce people to the values that we subscribe to? I mean, there is a whole chain of events that we need to look at. It's not just about having the person on the other side of the table in front of us, and then the conversation is over, and we're quite happy that we have selected the right person. And so it goes about transactions, it goes about procurement processes, it goes about budgeting, the whole notion that financial profit is just a mere number. It is not. It is representative of the way in which that profit actually has been made. So we need to use a values lens to interrogate also all the activities that we might engage in, because values are not a separate or a special conversation. It's an everyday conversation, and it's part of normal business.
Yeah, I think a really important point from what you just said, for me anyway, was that sometimes leaders are so caught up in the operations that they forget about everything. And I think that we've seen this with so many organizations, Facebook, Google. Today we were just doing about Theranos in class, Volkswagen, Toyota. We've seen it so much. And it becomes so difficult for leaders who are generally at the top and maybe not so much engaged. And I mean the real word engaged, not just the odd tokenistic maybe meeting, to sort of separate, or like you say, put the brakes on this profit-driven approach or aim, to then say, let's claw things back and let's look at what we're doing. Because I suppose if the leader does do that, then we wouldn't have so many, not just corporate fraud, but so many problems, so much turnover, so much disengagement happening. And I think that sort of leads to, this notion of, can ethical or ethics and ethical competence of people actually be strengthened? I mean, today, my students who were doing about Theranos, and we had some really great presentations and some acting out and dressed up. Netta was dressed up as Elizabeth Holmes. And, repeatedly within presentations, they were talking about, her background, and her dad was at Theranos, and this is how she was brought up. These were sort of just, and I think this is with all of us, this is sort of just the way that things are. We don't, and it's so difficult to disengage when you're older to hold on, is what I'm doing, what I've been brought up to do, actually right, or is it not right? Or who am I as opposed to my values, to what I was brought up by? So when we talk about ethical competence, can it be strengthened? And also, should organizations say, hey, hold on, you come here, I'm going to work on your ethics and your values and make you more ethically competent? Because then we're sort of moving into this boundary of, this is not just what you're doing within an organization that's ethical, but it's also, who are you as a person? I often, for example, joke with my students, I have an obsession with stationery. And whenever I find a board marker in the class that somebody's left, I say, should I take this? Should I not? And my students are, always sort of parted. So how do we strengthen employees or even people's ethical competence within organizations and within even society? And whose role is it to do that? And is it even ethical to do that, to kind of barge in and say, hold on, I'm going to strengthen your ethical competence?
Can I go back to just one thing that you have said right in the beginning, because I really would like to respond to that.
Yeah, sure.
I like to refer to the pain in the system. Stakeholders, either internal or external, who complain about something, they need to be heard. Because you have, for instance, referred to Volkswagen, and we can refer to many other organizations. Sometimes very early, in many of these scandals that ended up in the public space, there was a stakeholder, either internal or external, who said that there is pain in the system, there is discomfort somewhere. And then we also learned that it was either an executive or a board who refused to attend to that, only to afterwards suffer the consequences. And not just only the consequences of ethical reputation, but massive falls in share price, for instance. And people's jobs are at stake and everything that goes with it. So if there are signals, pick them up, deal with them respectfully, allow the people who actually express that, allow them a safe space where they can talk and where their concerns can be addressed. So I just want to make that point, because story after story after story shows us that ignoring pain in the system, carried by the discomfort of certain stakeholders, absolutely just lead to greater costs afterwards. In terms of developing ethical competence, yes, certainly one can do so. Culturally speaking, culture does have, if it's healthy and vibrant and ethically infused, it does have an educational impact. It is so much easier to be surrounded by people who embrace the same set of ethical values, being mindful about what they decide and what they do in the interest of the greater good. It makes life so much easier. Ethical leadership is a team game. It is not just something that is individually pinned. It's a team game. That's part of what humanity is all about. Values and ethics and habits are being grown in relationships. And we also need that to take that into account in our organizations. On the other hand, the work that we do on the basis of Mary Gentile is giving voice to values. also help us to understand that when people have established that something is not right and they know what the right thing is to do, we can help them to learn the skills of how to do the right thing. So from that perspective, to help people to deal, for instance, with the discomfort that they feel when they are in a situation where ethical compromise looms. Dishonesty, discrimination, exploitation, harassment, nepotism, price inflation, quality and safety issues. I mean, they abound all throughout businesses. So when people know that something is wrong and they know what the opposite is, and they know what is the nature of a dilemma, that kind of feeling, I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't, but if I don't, I might feel I've let myself and many people down. Vis-a-vis, if I do act, speak or act differently, then it is not necessarily comfortable, but it might produce better outcomes. And understanding the excuses that we sometimes present for not addressing these kind of issues. And what is very helpful, for instance, in Mary's work is moving from these rationalizations or excuses for not doing the right thing to what we call rescripting. In other words, finding good reasons, but reasons that fit with ordinary, everyday business language and behaviors to turn those dilemmas into good and positive outcomes, and then empower people with the comfort, with the courage, the confidence to give at least one or two steps in terms of doing so. We talk about building the ethical muscle. All of us who've been involved in these kind of conflicts, you know about the fear, the anxiety, about the kind of hurdles in terms of stepping over and speaking and doing something about them. But the second time around, it becomes easier. And the third time around, you might feel more confident. The fourth time around, you can actually start exerting some kind of a positive influence and start mentoring others, actually, in terms of getting it done. So we can teach people skills, and they can overcome these kind of hurdles, and it can lead to a positive outcome for their organizations over time. We've seen it happen, and if you do that in teams, for instance, cultures start changing, communication changes, problem solving becomes easier, not necessarily plain sailing all the time, but there are quite a number of benefits that can accrue from it.
Okay, we mentioned, and you mentioned this giving voice to values approach. And I first heard about this a few years ago, and then when I met you in South Africa, it's 4 years ago now. You know, we went through the whole training, if you like, over a few days, and eating lots of good food in South Africa. I remember that. So maybe you could just tell us, what is this giving voice to values approach, and you know, what are the aims of it in terms of building ethical competence?
Yeah, it was a good experience that we had in South Africa. And I think there was an invitation for me to come to Egypt one day.
Well, the invitation is still there, so you're welcome. I don't know if our food is as good as in South Africa, but we'll try. Please, yeah.
So I think I've explained already part of that. In other words, when we talk about, let's talk about the idea of a script. There are many scripts, ways in which we talk, ways in which we behave. You will, for instance, find in organizations something such as, it doesn't help talking to him or her, they never listen. That person never has any time. Or you know what, power always wins. That'll be a career limiting act. Here what I'm trying to talk about, these kind of scripts that suppress the possibility that we can actually take a values discomfort and turn it into a positive solution and doing differently. So understanding these kind of scripts is very important in the process. So what we do is to help people to understand the emotional connection that kind of I'm seeing something, I'm experiencing something that makes me either very anxious, fearful, maybe I experience some disgust, connecting that to which values are being compromised, finding the essence of the dilemma at stake. And then Mary highlights 4 excuses. Well, this is how things are being done around here. Or, you know what? This is not that important, so let it go. It is not material. Or another one that people like to use is, no, this is not on my payroll or on my pay grade. This is for something more important than me to deal with it. Or the problem actually sits with the unit next door. It's the other department's fault. It's got nothing to do with us. Or to say, I'm really in a fix here because I'm caught between loyalties, and hence I would rather like to stay away from this. Once people see these rationalizations for what they are and identify these kind of excuses, it becomes easier to understand, but I can get beyond this. And this is where the rescripting task comes in. And this is where we need to help people to learn how to ask different kind of questions that will elicit different kinds of conversations. Let me give you a lovely example of what I think was a beautiful rescript that I listened into from someone in a training program a while ago. It's a person sitting in a board meeting. He's a relative junior. He has joined the board quite just a few months before. He's sitting with seniors, old hands around the table, who kind of always have done things in the way that they've done it. And there was an issue on the table around the appointment of a service provider. But that service provider was a kind of an elephant in the room, as we would call it in my country. An elephant in the room, and he knew that. But how can a junior board member speak in the presence of so much authority and power to express his discomfort about the possibility that this service provider will be appointed? And he figured out, if I can only just initiate a conversation about the merits of this service provider, we might have an outcome that's better. And all that he did was to ask the question, was this service provider appointed previously by the company? And the answer was yes. So immediately it raises the stakes, because here is another opportunity for the same person to be appointed again. And then the next question was, so were you satisfied by the quality of service that was delivered? And all of a sudden, the answer was no. And he didn't have to do anything about solving the problem, except for planting that question, because then the conversation took care of itself. So can we ask different kind of questions? Can we bring information to bear that help people to see new realities? Can we point, for instance, to case studies that might be present in the press about similar potential risks that our own organization might be facing, and say, if we make the same kind of decision, what then? What if it becomes public knowledge that we are doing X, Y, or Z? So the rescripting exercise is an important one. And then how to find leverage from your own experience, from trusted and wise mentors, from also bringing to bear conversations around your organization's policy statements, or the legal position around something, or the constitutional position around something, where there might be leverage from. So we can enhance the skills. And I think we have found Mary indeed has documented many stories across the world together with the research associates. We have found in the work that I'm doing here in South Africa, we have found good examples of people who step beyond and start engaging in different kinds of conversations. The one thing that one should not do is to say, this is against my values. I don't want to do anything with this, because that's a conversation stopper. It puts you on the moral high ground. and it disowns you the possibility of having a stake in the ongoing conversation, because people then experience that you present yourself as better than them.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about this value-driven leadership program, and relating it to obviously giving voice to values approach. So maybe you could talk just maybe as a kind of a final thing, although probably I'll think of something else, a little bit about the values-driven leadership program, and what have you found personally? What have your observations been, and challenges that you faced from people in orienting their relationships and their ethical competence, and kind of embedding this notion of values into their thinking that will drive them into their organizations?
Let me first say that people experience it as an immense gift to be involved in a conversation where they can speak freely and learn how to deal with this. I think that's the first observation that I would like to make. The second is that we really identify that values-based dilemmas, they abound in organizations. You don't need to look for them. They're in every appointment, in every meeting, in every procurement discussion, in every contract. It's all over the place. So you don't need to look for it. There is no special occasion for it. It's always there. But it helps a lot to be prepared and to know better how to engage with them when they arise. So learning that it's part of normal everyday business, I think, is an important one. And maybe a third one that I could raise is that people really find pathways for productive problem solving, realizing that values-based conversations and giving voice to values is as part of productive and ordinary problem solving than any operational decision-making process about an investment or a new product, or I've referred to appointments and so on, might be. So the moment that we make that part of the everyday live experience, lived experience of people in organizations, I think then it becomes more natural and it becomes more easy.
I think just maybe just a final question before we go to people that are raising their hands. I mean, obviously, you're living in South Africa, and that has a whole history to it. And in Egypt, we're generally, I suppose, a monoculture. We're predominantly, Egyptians here. We're not so diverse as a culture as compared to, for example, the UK or the US or European countries. So perhaps we don't have the same, if you like, pulling and pushing so much in issues around, maybe values or ethics and what have you. So, I mean, obviously, if you're in a culture, in a society, and even in an organizational culture where you have people from diverse cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds, even, genders now more and more, what sorts of challenges do you think a leader would face in terms of values, as opposed to an organization that just is sort of quite mono, if you like?
That's an interesting question, and I hope that I can respond to that in a helpful manner. The fact that one might be living in what you call a monoculture does not necessarily make it easier. Let's, for instance, take the value of respect in a society that, for instance, might be very authoritarian and male-orientated, and you have gender issues when it comes to the right and the access for women, for instance, to speak. The dynamic is similar to what it might be in another situation that's very diverse. You still have a power relationship. that might be suppressive of certain kinds of conversations. So it might be actually that monoculture idea are equally difficult to deal with than what, for instance, a very diverse situation, such as in my country, for instance, might be. So in our case, we probably have to deal with people from at least 9 plus language groups in the country, people from a variety of races, of histories, and so on. And now we come to the table to figure out together what a particular value and the application thereof in practice might mean to us. And this is what I have related to earlier in the conversation when I spoke about norm-producing conversations. In a monoculture, the norm-producing conversation might be suppressed by means of how the culture might have become cemented in a sense. And everybody has made their peace, more or less, with what the state of things might be. In a diverse culture, it is much more, it's much more outspoken, it's much more dynamic, it's much more rousy, for instance, than what it might be in another. But there we have a very particular challenge of making those norm-producing conversations possible. In other words, coming from different backgrounds, we have the imperative that we need to agree on how do we do this together. Whereas in the monoculture, you might have the opposite of that same challenge. In other words, on how to make it possible to interrogate something that might actually silence the voices of criticism over time. And that's maybe the different sides of the same coin.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Very, very politically correct as well. I have to say. Very, yeah. It's been such an interesting conversation, and I think we could keep talking about this. And so we'll continue the conversation with people from the audience. So perhaps we'll go to Professor Ali Aouni first. Who is the director of the Gerhardt Center.
Sorry, Nelly, let's go by the order. The order is Yusuf, Galal, Noor, Sharif, and then myself.
Sure. Okay, right.
Trying to be ethical.
I don't know. I don't even know if it started like that, Ali, because Zena was actually the first person that had her.
I was just joking.
No, go on, Ali, go on. Maybe
no. Let Yusuf. I insist. We go with the order.
And maybe when you ask questions, maybe you could just turn your cameras on so we can give a face to the voice, you know. So maybe we could start with Zena. Please go ahead.
So you spoke about organizational culture earlier, which I find really interesting. So I wanted to ask something about that. It's kind of related to the question that Dr. Nedley also posed. So given that workplace diversity is a very big trend right now, having people from different cultures and people that have different values in the workplace, how does that work? Yani, how does that work in trying to formulate an organizational culture when you have people from individualistic cultures or collectivist cultures with very different values? How do you get them to all fit into one mold or one organizational culture? How do you even create that?
I make the distinction between two types of values. The one stream of values that we will find in organizations you can refer to as strategic values. In other words, that which the organization have agreed about, that this is what they would like to be known for. Let me just say something such as good customer service, as for instance, one example. On the other hand, we have what I refer to as moral values, and the moral values are those that I've referred to as honesty, respect, responsibility, fairness, and compassion. These values we do not have choice about because they don't belong to me or they don't belong to the organization. They belong to humanity at large. Moral values, aspirations about what the best is that we can be, as persons and for one another. Now the way in which I see the relationship between the two is that we use our moral values to interrogate and discuss the nature in which we live our strategic values. So let's say we have a value in terms of a good customer service, but we do not provide for that customer a safe product at a good price. Then we have reason to talk about honesty, about respect for the customer, about responsibility towards the health and safety of the customer, about fairness towards somebody that needs to buy something from us that, for instance, might not be up to standard and quality. You see what I'm trying to say is that, yes, it is a difficult task, but organizations are two things at the same time. Organizations are enterprises and they need to make money, they need to put a profit on the table and so on. But they're also communities at the same time, where people work together and need to relate together in order to get the work done. The task of leaders is to embrace both those aspects of what it means to be an organization. So there will be strategic values that we need to agree upon and also agree on how we're going to exercise those values, but they also need to be moral values at the same time. And the task of leaders are to join these two together and allow them to coexist and to interrogate across the line as we lead and as we do our organizational work. I mean, this is a long conversation. I think in terms of your question, it's a big question, but for now, I think this is what I would like to respond.
Okay, thank you, Zina. We'll go to Noor Khalil.
Oh, good evening. First of all, thank you very much for your time. It's been a very, very insightful talk. I wanted to ask you, do you think that a moral leader can actually survive in an unethical organization? And if not, should they just quit or should they try to make a change? And if they do try to make a change, how easy would that be?
It would be very unfortunate if all moral leaders leave their organizations, or if a good moral leader leave a particular organization. Organizations are human communities, and none of them are perfect. Some, I think, are more complex and more confused around values and morals than what others might be. And it might be that a leader might have to make the ultimate choice of quitting a particular position. But at the same time, one also would like to believe and hope that a good moral leader will show the necessary resilience and bring change over time. And I think there are examples in history of people who have actually done so. Bring the change, because the moment that level of morality and the commitment towards leading this change, when it starts bearing fruit, there will be inevitably other people in the organization that will welcome that and that will also join over time. We do not want people to work and live in fear in their organizations. We want them to be fully human, living values in a manner that's productive and energizing. And maybe such a leader, if they can spark some people to actually believe that that is ultimately possible, can change an organization over time. But if the ultimate choice is there, then one would understand.
Yeah, I think that point's really important about sparking people. And I don't know if that's related to, charisma or what, or belief, or I don't know what, but I think it's a, and Ali's also put, yes, I agree. I think that's a, this idea where you ignite something in people. I think that's really important. It made me remember Paul Polman, who was the CEO of Unilever and did a fantastic job at creating sustainability and would talk often about eradicating poverty and climate change in, I mean, not so many years ago, but in a time, you know, that really, you know, he was from, I think, 2008 or 9, the CEO at Unilever. And it, you know, it wasn't a time then when CEOs would be talking so much about aspects like this. So I think it's really important, this notion of having a leader to, I really like this concept of sparking something in people. Thank you, Noor. We'll go to Galal, please.
Hi, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Arnold. I just have a question, and it's regarding this sort of combination of free speech, free will, individualism, people's creativity, I guess, and the society's needs or pressures to conform to ethical frameworks or moral values. Does that in a way hinder your own creativity or your individuality or your, I guess, freedom of speech if, for example, you don't conform to these moral values or these ethics that are upheld by society?
Great question.
I hope that I understand your question correctly, but I am a deep believer in the fact that life is about relationships. Life is about being born from relationships and living within relationships, irrespective of where I live this. There is no such thing as a solitude existence, I think, of being a human. You will simply fade out, and life will become meaningless. So it is an ongoing negotiation. It's an ongoing negotiation between what you might be very convinced of and deeply believe in, and sometimes the differences that you might have with other people. So let me make it very concrete, for instance. This is typically the kind of conversation that's currently raging in many countries around vaccinations. And here in my country, the constitutional position is very clear, namely that whilst the individual does have rights, and also therefore the right to follow a different belief, the merit of the benefit of the greater good in terms of the protection of society as a whole needs to trump the individual preference, let's say, for instance, for not getting vaccinated. That does not mean that such an individual is being marginalized, but such an individual then has to carry the consequences of that choice in terms of special arrangements, and maybe even in terms of not having access to certain gatherings or meetings or events and so on. So life is about relationships. And those relationships demand from us a constant negotiation between what is right and what is wrong, and also between the individual and the group, and also then the consequences of what that might lead to in terms of the individual either being heard and accepted, or maybe ultimately deciding not to follow a particular path that the group might prefer, and then making a different choice. But it starts with my belief that life is about relationships. I cannot be so singularly important to myself that it is impossible to find a way of living and working with other people in a constructive manner and find answers to the questions that we have in common.
So I like that about relationships. Life's about relationships. Great. Okay, let's go to Yusuf Abdulati. Yusuf?
Yes, hi. Sorry about the setup here, but I just wanted to ask a question. Earlier on, it was. Can you guys hear me properly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, earlier on, you were discussing corporate culture having an educational impact, and I sat there wondering from a macro perspective, like, why don't we start like talking about ethics from a younger age. I mean, why are we talking about ethics from the corporate level? I mean, these guys are probably 25 or 30 years old, and then we're trying to like have an educational impact. But why not start young? I mean, just like we teach languages, for example. I mean, we start with the English language, for example, from very, very young age, probably from foundation years. And I'm sat here wondering, like, why don't we use the same concept with ethics and try to talk about ethical dilemmas from a young age?
Look,
that's a good question. I'm just going to add a little bit to that question as well. So, you know, does it then also become complex when you try to do that? And we've seen this in the UK when there's children from different religious backgrounds and parents may protest on what they believe ethics and values are that are being taught to the children. So just in addition to kind of to Yusuf's, you know, what do you do with that dilemma as well?
Yeah, so the education starts from the first day that you are born. There's a maybe not as an explicit use of educational process in terms of your awareness of that in your household where you grow up, but you are being taught, and I mean that's the answer that we get across the board when we talk about, so where are your perception of ethics and values coming from? People say, well, from my father and my mother, from the community in which I grew up, and so on. So from the household, you go to school. The same process plays out there. Maybe the process doesn't have a name as explicitly as we give it here. And then in the end, but it's an educational process. Then you go to university, and the university applies either explicitly or implicitly an educational process around ethics and values that you are steeped into. And sometimes we need to have a conversation about whether that's always along the best possible lines of ethicality and the upholding of good values. But the point is that the education, if explicitly or implicitly, that it continues in your course that you currently have, it has been made explicit. Then you go to the workplace. And in the workplace, the conversation becomes more complex, specifically when diversity and inclusion might become at stake for people coming from different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds, different nationalities. And it brings me back to what I have just referred to earlier. There we have to have a norm-producing conversation, a norm-producing process. In other words, agreements about that despite the differences that we have, some obvious and some less obvious, but despite the differences that we have, we need to come to an agreement about the way in which we do things around here until that becomes problematic again and the conversation needs to repeat itself. So Yusuf, I understand that the problem that you raise, but this educational process does not start in organizations. You have been surrounded by them since the day that you've been born. It is expressed differently in different contexts all along the way. But the organizational challenge is a particularly complex one. And we need to find processes in order to make that challenge work for everyone concerned. I hope that helps, Yusuf.
Thank you, Yusuf, as well for asking the question. We'll just go to Rawan. Rawan, please.
Okay, so since we're talking about like value-driven leadership and so on, so I think throughout the ethical scandals that occur in the business environment, like I sometimes do see like how there would be people within the organization, like sometimes even top managers, they would want to implement positive change within like the minor ethical matters that happen within the business on like the everyday basis, but they would resist this change, especially that if the cost of this change is higher than the benefit, like they would want to avoid losses, they would want to retain control over the situation. So like how can an individual or like a manager, how can they unlearn their organizational culture before creating a new knowledge within the organization itself?
It's a complex question, and I hope that I will be able to answer that in a way that's helpful for you. I think the one thing that I've referred to earlier was to create a culture of openness and accessibility, a culture where people are being listened to and have the opportunity to address the discomfort that they might be having. There is also together with that, there was something. Ruan, can you just maybe help me once again with the gist of your question? Because I've interrupted my train of thought here because there was something that I wanted to highlight. And if you can just maybe summarize the gist of your question again.
Okay, so I was asking, how can managers unlearn their organizational culture before creating new knowledge within the organization itself?
How can they unlearn the organizational culture? So in other words, are you suggesting with that sometimes a manager needs actually to turn against the dominant culture in the organization? Exactly,
especially if there are illegalities and ethical issues within the organization.
Yeah, okay. So if you are in a managerial position and you have power, it is somewhat easier than when you are in a junior position and you don't have managerial power or the authority to bring in those changes. And organizations provide, for instance, for whistleblowing practices. And so often we see that whistleblowers are being exorcised, they're marginalized, they're pushed out of the organization because organizations do not like the idea of being confronted with unethicality in their own midst. So a manager that would like to start behaving differently will also have, and this is the difficult thing that we are dealing with here, will also have to be quite sure that he or she has a clean record.
Okay.
Yeah, because if you don't have a clean record, if you are not known for ethicality and integrity, and consistency of choice and example, and you then try to change things, people are going to marginalize you immediately because they won't find you authentic, and that's sometimes the dilemma. So starting this will eventually mean that you will have to be able to stand up for and be counted for what you believe in. There's a CEO, a well-known CEO of a financial services institution in South Africa, who used to have the saying and say that CEO stands actually for the Chief Ethics Officer of the organization. And I think he's right.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Rowan. We'll go to Sharif, please.
Good evening, Doctor.
Good evening, Sharif.
From my point of view, I always think that ethics is a very, very big topic. And at the end of the day, you cannot achieve an ethical organization or an ethical culture unless the people are really ethical in it. And there was a question raised earlier about whether are there ethical leaders or not. From my point of view, I think there are ethical leaders everywhere. But when they go to the actual workplace and they try to implement their ethical background, they either get demotivated or they get screwed about it because people think that they're just gonna waste money on he will waste money on educational purposes. So do you think that the world might sometime witness 100% ethical workplace or not?
No, we will never experience 100% ethicality because we're all normal people and we're vulnerable and fallible. We do make mistakes. You and I, we do make mistakes. The question is whether we can live up to and own up to our mistakes in correcting them and so on. But we will never find organizations in the same manner that we will never find pure ethicality in any person. We will also never find organizations that we can describe as purely ethical. It is a process that we need to go through. On the other hand, Sharif, it's also important that we should not perceive organizations as inherently unethical and start with a fight even before we enter into the organization. because all organizations have a mix of good people and not so good people. And it's about finding those good people. It's about building those relationships. It's about catching people not only when they do wrong, but catching them when they do right, and to praise and reward them for that. This is how we start building a more explicit ethical orientation in our organizations. But we should be careful, I think, to work with the assumption that there is no such thing as an ethical organization. We should work with the assumption that together with yourself, there are people who would like to see that the best and the good things happen for the sake of humanity, for the sake of their organizations, society in particular, and so forth. So we need to be careful for fighting against something before we have reason to put such fight up. That would probably be my response to what you've just said.
Okay, thank you, Sharif. Nada, Afifi?
Good evening, Dr. and Mr.
Nada was the one that dressed up as Theranos today, Arnold. She actually wore a blonde wig and put blue contact lenses in, so she went the extra mile.
Wow.
Right.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for this interesting conversation. I had a quick question, like when it comes to whistleblowing, like taking it from the employee's perspective, we can find that there are like various values involved, and each value could perhaps lead towards like a different path or a contradicting path. For instance, like honesty would direct us like to speak up if there's fraud or any unethical behavior occurring, while loyalty may push us more towards like staying silent. So what should employees do when they're faced with dilemmas where like different values lead them towards different actions or different paths? For instance, like are there certain values that should take priority over others?
Well, I can't see how I can say that today I'm in the mood for honesty, but I'm not in the mood for fairness. Or today I'm going to drive responsibility. Don't talk to me about compassion. It's natural that values will appeal to us simultaneously, and that's part of the complexity of dealing with values-based dilemmas. You might need, for instance, in an organization to deal with a performance problem of somebody, and you need to call that person to responsibility. But at the same time, you know that there might be COVID at home. So are you going to use COVID as a way of being softer? Or are you going to sit with such an employee and make a different plan around how the work can still be done? Because the moment that you create a precedent in terms of treating the one person differently from the other one, then your trouble starts. So keeping values together in the same space, I think that's important, because the one can't be prioritized over the other, specifically moral values. You have to figure it out, and sometimes you might come to conclusions that are less favorable and difficult to make, and that might feel like a compromise. That's I'm not talking about an unethical compromise, but I'm talking about a kind of solution that is not the ultimate of what you would like to have. So we need to take that into account. Whistleblowers, in the case of whistleblowers, I mean, that's a complex issue, and I'm not an expert on whistleblowing. But if the organization can't protect whistleblowers, it would be good in such a situation for somebody to get advice from outside, to find a mentor in terms of how to engage around such issues. Too many whistleblowers have trusted their organizations just in the end to fall prey to people who did not act in their interest, who did not respect them for what they did. So, but there are expert knowledge available about the whistleblowing situation, which I do not necessarily want to go into now, but I think you get what I try to say. One should also, in dealing with an ethical dilemma, not necessarily assume that whistleblowing is the only and ultimate route to follow. Therefore, we do this Giving Voice to Values program, in which we help people to re-script even those situations that might end up in whistleblowing, to prevent them from going there, and to instill and inspire different kinds of conversations in the organization.
Okay, thank you. So one of our last questions, Salma Ghanem, go on.
Hi, so first I want to thank you for the amazing talk. My question is basically that we are all now who are almost seniors and some of us are juniors and we are about to graduate. So I was wondering that if we are like that kind of people who are aiming to like open our own business and so on, what is like this specific advice that you would give us in order to maintain the leadership or the ethical leadership concept that you were talking about? So like this is specific advice in order to maintain our values and like maintain the ethical and the moral values within the organization that we are aiming to open or create.
Okay, so the one thing is that visit to yourself and your own motives and your own ethicality and the embrace of the values that you would like to promote. So be authentic, reflective, and certain of yourself. The second is that you need to surround yourself with the right people. If somebody lacks knowledge about something, you can always do something about it. But if somebody lacks virtue and the values that you would like to uphold, I mean, then you have a big problem, because then you have a problem around trust. So surround yourself with the right people. The third thing I would like to say is make sure that values conversations are from the beginning part of your normal menu of conversations in all decisions that you make and transactions that you engage in and the processes that you develop in your organization. So make that part of the daily meal, not something that you reserve for special occasions.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's a general lesson. For life, you know, surrounding. Salma, let me just ask you, Salma, are you planning to open your own business? Was that the rationale behind it? The question? Unmute.
Good luck. Then you don't have all these other problems.
I was not able to unmute myself. Yeah, like I already start like I already have the idea, and I'm just waiting to graduate in order to implement it. So actually this talk made me like think, okay, so it seems that it's very, very important like to have this and the thing that we discussed so far. So I just wanted like to write the most important thing that I should put into consideration while I'm opening my own business. So yeah.
Okay, great. We'll just ask last question. If we can just go to Angus, please, who's a professor of practice in our school. Angus. I don't know if you're there. Angus, you're muted. Hold on.
That working. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Nelly. Thank you, Dr. Smit. It's fascinating listening to this and so many angles to the issue of ethics and general governance. My background's in investment banking. And I have to say, as you will know, and I'm certain in your research, Nelly too, is that the world of finance still needs very fundamental changes in terms of ethics, small and large. And having worked in the city where people would use the phrase, oh, someone is a loose cannon, I'm sure you'll know the phrase. And normally, whenever I heard that, I realized quite quickly in my career, normally the person who said it was part of the problem. And that they didn't encourage questioning, skepticism, challenging to make the entity better. And I've discovered over time, it may be painful, but it's better to be a disruptor to induce change. For the better is better for everyone. But it's fascinating to listen to what you're saying internally within an institution. But what I would ask of you is, if you look at somebody like Dan Price of Gravity Payments in America, who cut his own salary, raised everyone else's salary, and he's created a truly ethical business up against quite a number of other institutions larger than him who are not that ethical, who are winning more business. How do we move this kind of behavior to encourage and support other businesses if one is trying to lead an ethical business? How do we make that network and encourage others to do the same? Thanks.
I've read about that example. Thank you for the question, Angus. I mean, how will I approach that now? I think there's the one thing that one appreciates about that is somebody who enters into his own business environment with a deep sense, I think, of fairness and across the board for himself and his employees. And he was standing up, I think, against a big test about whether or not it eventually will generate loyalty, collaboration, energy, productivity, output, and so forth for his business. And that, I think, is a big swim against the stream of what we, over the last few decades, have got to know about business in terms of the overall story that everything is about profit, it's about margins, it's about success, and so on. And I think it actually takes a deep sense of trust from any business leader to enter into that and say that that can work for my business as well. And there are other examples also, but I think they are few and far between. So I've never really considered how that will actually work in other businesses. And maybe can we have a conversation about it? What are your ideas about it?
Well, first of all, I've only just begun to think about it in the essence of listening to now. You've helped generate in my own head and being urged on by Nelly. How do we do this? Because I've thought about it long and hard. And the issue that Nelly raised is very interesting, or maybe one of your colleagues who brought this up, monolithic culture, which is actually more common, I think, than diversified culture, makes it exceptionally difficult to challenge and to question. And I have to say, in this environment where we are in business here in Egypt, it's quite difficult, if not quite impossible, to challenge, to question, because people take offense. And you'll understand the sentiment, even in developed economies, that is the case. And I think that whether it's through by association, finding a great example, discussing it, promoting it, taking Dan Price and making sure people are learning about it in academia, the question from students about, should we do this earlier? Absolutely, we should learn about ethics earlier and the importance of it, because transparency and accountability are vital in this new world we're going into, because all we see around us is growing oligopolistic behavior of entities. And we have to question before it becomes too late. How do we challenge the system? And I'm speaking to somebody who's been in finance a long time. How do we challenge it to make it better? And so that we can better do it, that improvement can help everyone across the board. And it's difficult. It's hard to think about it, but I would love to have another conversation with you and Nelly to try to see what we can do to do this.
Yeah. So now that you talk, I mean, there's the Dan Price example. There's what is that guy from Daily, from Maverick, the 7-day weekend. There is, can you remember the name? The South American. There is the Paul Polman example. There are several of these, and it seems that it will take quite a lot of courage to go in that direction. Oh, and the other one that I wanted to just refer to is also an example of an organization in the UK, Nelly, maybe you know about them, where they don't offer a CEO a salary, but where they say, come to us and tell us what you need. And if ever you need more, there is an open conversation that we can have the possibility of entertaining that which you might need on the upside. And always, 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 people come back and they realize that they actually need far less. They do not need to buy into this competitive drive for being comparable to the next CEO and the next and the next and the next. So a drive towards discovering simplicity and discovering that you actually need less. I mean, we need to have a moderating conversation about what is enough.
Yeah.
Specifically among us who are on the kind of the benefit side, I think, of life.
And I think there's some research on that about even choosing your own pay. I think Harvard did some research about that.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that's interesting. But then we're assuming that everyone maybe has this altruistic maybe side. But anyway, we'll go to our last question.
I just want to make one more comment. Angus, now that I also think about your question, in director development programs, for instance, I'm constantly confronted with the idea that people act as they act and they do as they do, want more and strive for particular margins because of the fact that their boards would like it to be the case.
Mm.
When I work on the inside of director training with board members, I discover many of them not wanting that, but to actually have a deep sensitivity around sustainability, around moderation, around simplicity, around doing the right thing, and so on. So I also think that some of this is a straw doll that we have set up, a myth in a sense, that many people have started to believe in, and we drive that myth to its very ultimate. And on the inside of the same, there are people who actually think differently. How do we unlock those conversations so that they can become part of the change? I think that's part of what we need to discuss.
That's a big challenge. How? We'll go to the last question because I'm conscious we're so over time. It's such an interesting webinar. So we'll go to Ali Aouni, the boss, for the last question, please, Ali.
Okay. It's more of a question and a suggestion. I think it's almost 20 years ago, Gert Hofstede, he talked about culture and organization. And he was actually talking about moral circle, and he was talking about analysis of world values. It's interesting. I mean, this book is never used in a quote-unquote business ethics course. Now, the other comment, which actually ties with what Yusuf was saying, Yusuf was trying to put it in terms of an education. Doesn't it make sense for any global corporation to have a code of ethics, a clear code of ethics? So I don't care about, I mean, there are certain things where you worry about individual cultures, but when it comes to the corporation, as long as I don't really aggressive about it, there is a code of ethics that you have to follow. So this is one. Now the other one, which is you keep mentioning the word compassionate. In service quality, they talk about empathy, but they talk about it as an attitude. And the word empathy comes also again when you talk about critical skills of change makers, basically social entrepreneurs. This is an Ashoka term. And I think there is a slight difference. Compassionate is more passive, I think. Empathy assumes that you're going to take action, that it's more active. English is not my first language, but that's the impression I have. Anyway, those are the two question and the comment. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, to just comment on the idea of compassion, empathy, and so, Ali, I think in the work on values that we do, for instance, there are several synonyms that can go, for instance, with honesty, such as transparency and integrity and so on. Respect might go with, for instance, dignity. You will sometimes find responsibility and accountability in the same context, sentence that people might be using. You might also find fairness, equity, and equality, for instance, in the same space. And you might find love and kindness and compassion and empathy and so on, also more or less in the same bucket. So maybe it is not about the exactness, more about, I think, the ideas that are being generated as a result of these notions. But at the heart of it, then, the 5 values that I've highlighted. My general sense is also that people easily buy into them, know what they look like, how they experience them, and also what happens when they are absent from organizations. So maybe it's not necessarily about the exactness of definition, but in terms of the variety of synonyms and also the vocabulary available in different cultures and languages to express them with. Ali, can you just maybe highlight for me once again your first question? This was the second one.
Gert Hofstede, Culture of Organizations, Analysis of World Values, and the probably use of a code of ethics in global.
Oh, that's right, the code of ethics. Yeah. Now, once again, the code of ethics as a much bespoken idea. For instance, Johnson & Johnson, now that we are in the midst of COVID, has got a very simple and straightforward code of ethics that's easily accessible, that can be easily understood, and so on. And I think there's a marvelous example of how you can set up a code of ethics. On the other hand, you might also find organizations, for instance, what we find in mining organizations is that their codes are much more complex because the stakes are so much higher when it comes to safety and risk for people working underground and so on. And there, it's a much more specifically defined and a much more expansive code that you can get. But codes of ethics are good ways of consolidating the diversity in such a workable manner that we can actually, as an organization, go forward together. But here is a story to close off with. About a year ago, I've worked with an organization in the financial services industry, Angus, to come back to that, where they went through quite a huge exercise in terms of renewing their values. And then when they published their integrated report at the end of that cycle, I did an interesting exercise. I looked at the appearance of the word value in their integrated report and tried to establish how often the word value or values are being used in the moral sense of the word, representing the exercise around values renewal that they have gone through prior to the publication of that report, and how many times value was related to financial matters. The word value appeared 350 times in the report. And I was asking them the question, so how often was that same concept being used for moral and relational purposes, vis-a-vis the use of that for financial purposes? And they had a very rosy view of the balance between the two. And actually, the result was that 349 out of the 350 times value was being used in financial terms, and only once in moral and relational terms, which maybe says a lot. Nelly, I don't want to end on a negative note, but I think it tells us about the challenge.
Right. Thank you so much, Arnold. It's been such an interesting, insightful, thought-provoking webinar, and thank you everyone also for your insightful questions, and I think there's so much more that we could talk about, and I really loved Yusuf's point about introducing kind of ethics really kind of formally maybe into schools, but of course then there's the whole complexity around that, and obviously Angus's point about the financial sector and the difficulties and challenges with that. So really, thank you so much, Arnold. It's been a pleasure, and I don't like to use the word privilege, but we will privilege to have you with us, and for helping us to understand the topic so much more, and hopefully to get us all thinking and be more conscious of this notion of values and ethics on an everyday basis. So with that in mind, thank you so much, Arnold, and we hope to see you in Cairo at some point soon, and host you in person, and we look forward to that. Thank you so much, Arnold, and for everyone that's watching and everyone that's with us, today. We have an upcoming webinar in a couple of days on making market rate impact investment in the Global South. And we have a moderator from the Ford Foundation and two other guests, Basil Mufta and Hossein Abu Musa. So that's another interesting webinar coming up from the Gerhardt Center. And thank you everyone so much for joining. Thank you, Arnold, and I hope to see you in person soon. Take care.
My pleasure, and all the best to everybody. Thank you very much once again, Nelly.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold, for the webinar.
Thank you, Ali. Difficult questions.
See you soon.
Difficult questions. But it was a real pleasure to engage with the webinar. There were also there were also some South African participants I saw. Recognized.
Lots of them.
Yeah,
we miss Samantha. Samantha usually every now and then she would attend.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I say goodbye and thank you once again.
Sure thing. Take care.